And a half after President Biden's press conference was supposed to begin. Breaking news as we start with live pictures of the NATO summit in Washington. What they call the head-on shot of President Biden's podium has gone down. This is exactly 2 weeks after his disastrous debate. And think about how much has changed in 2 weeks of American politics. President Biden's Hail Mary press conference isn't going well. It hasn't even started. President Biden has had 3 long days at the NATO conference. He faces a growing mutiny by the hour within his own party. And the press conference of his life is now delayed, long delayed, into well past what we know is his comfortable time to do events. We have the entire NewsNation team, including Tom Dempsey, at the press conference for the pregame, here with the panel as well. But first, zoom out and we're going to give you the state of play right now. We're moments away from President Biden's first solo press conference since November. Stakes couldn't be higher, both for him politically, but also for our country. And a great showing tonight may not be enough. This is the fairest show on television. We're going to be as fair to President Biden as we possibly can be. He deserves that. The country deserves that. But things keep getting worse for President Biden. About an hour ago, Mr. Biden confused the Ukrainian president who he was hosting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin.
Ukraine will prevail in this war, and we'll stand with them every single step of the way. That's what the compact says, loudly and clearly. And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway.
And this is the problem for Team Biden. The press will now rightly focus on every misstep. They will exponentially cover every misstep rather than perhaps look past it as they did in the past. Already 13 Democratic defectors have publicly called on the president to leave the race. Most recently, Michigan Congressman Hillary Schlotkin and Illinois Congressman Brad Schneider. Also, one Democratic congresswoman basically said the president needs to resign. As we said on Monday, if you can't run for president, you shouldn't be president. But the leaks in the Biden dam continue to get bigger. NewsNation spoke with several Democratic lawmakers, including some recognizable and senior names in both chambers, and their support is starting to waver.
I think he'll make the right decision, and that's the only decision. The right decision is what's right for him. He's going to make that decision.
Some of my concerns are allayed. Some others have been deepened. I need more of the kind of analytics that show the path to success.
Our conversations have been candid, comprehensive, and clear-eyed, and they are ongoing.
Guys, I'm not going to talk, but I'd love to give anybody else need some water?
Water. Not support for President Biden. Meanwhile, the New York Times is out with 2 damning pieces. The embattled Biden campaign is testing Kamala Harris's strength against Trump, particularly with new polls commissioned by the campaign itself. Conceivably, perhaps, that is to show donors that Kamala Harris doesn't do any better. Could also be to see what their options are. Some Biden advisors are now discussing how to convince him to step aside. Yesterday, we told you former President Obama was probably behind the George Clooney op-ed telling Mr. Biden to drop out. Turns out that that is likely true. Now the shot of the podium is back up, so we're minutes away from President Biden taking the stage. But the host of MSNBC's Morning Joe seemed to suggest that Obama is pulling the strings of the Biden mutiny.
The Biden campaign and many Democratic officials do believe that Barack Obama is quietly working behind the scenes to orchestrate this.
Barack Obama has a lot of influence, and I think that there's a lot there.
There's a lot there.
There's a lot there.
There's a lot there, Willie.
Right now, the best thing going for President Biden is he is the president. He stands behind the presidential seal. That is an enormous pulpit from which to convince the world that the past 2 weeks and that debate performance was a one-off. And he is effectively the Democratic nominee. He is the Democratic nominee in terms of the delegates. Forcing him out will be a bloody endeavor for Democrats, forcing him out, and that may not succeed. If Mr. Biden puts down the mutiny, it's going to start when he takes the stage in just a few minutes. With us now, NewsNation Chief Washington Correspondent, host of The Hill, Blake Berman, NewsNation Washington Correspondent Kelly Meyer, former acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, Lauren Wright, Associate Research Scholar and Lecturer at Princeton University. We start with Tom Dempsey, who is live tonight at the NATO summit inside the room where President Biden will soon address the staff. Tom, I guess you're just outside the room all day. Tell us the anticipation of this event and why it's now an hour and 35 minutes late.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting last 30 minutes to an hour, Leland. Look, it's been a lot of waiting, a lot of running, and a lot of walking to get to this point where we are right now. And we're still continuing to wait to get inside where this press conference is going to be held at the NATO summit. I want to show you just the amount of journalists that are here. This press conference has at least double the amount of journalists from what I saw from some of the other press conferences we saw here at the NATO summit. And like you said, we've seen multiple delays with this press conference. And I think that speaks to just how, busy of a schedule and all the things that are on the agenda with this NATO summit. Earlier today, President Joe Biden meeting one-on-one with Vladimir Zelensky. He had multiple working sessions with various leaders from around the world. And, that leads us to this press conference that's now been delayed. But there are a lot of journalists here. I'm looking back. This line stretches well beyond from where I'm standing right now. I'll give you another look of just how many people are waiting in line right here. We're going to be going in soon.
All right, Tom, we'll check in with you as you head in. Now possibly hearing a 7:30 start time, so yet a longer delay. With the panel now, Mick Mulvaney, a few things. One, talk about not setting up a president who doesn't do well after 3 long days for success. And number two, the room. Tom Dempsey made an excellent point. A lot of journalists in that room. That means he can call on the usual White House press corps. He can also call on a reporter from Le Monde in France to give him a softball.
Yeah, but I don't think the reporter from Le Monde in France is going to give him a softball. Put yourself in that reporter's shoes. If you have a chance to change history by asking a question about the president's mental capacity, aren't you going to do it? And by the way, I saw something in the
reporter's Machiavellian. I would never.
I saw something in the intro that we didn't. That I've not seen earlier tonight, which was a different angle on the Zelensky versus Putin misstep. Okay, we'd not seen that angle before. Before we saw it from the straight on, and of course the reason we use teleprompters as politicians is that we can look like we're speaking extemporaneously when we really are looking at the. But we saw the side angle, and what you saw there was he did fine when he was reading off of the teleprompter, and at the end he started to wing it, and that's when he lost it. And he lost it in the first 5 seconds of winging it, and that does not bode well for tonight.
You hear anything from the White House on that moment?
I was actually just going to say I was looking at Zelensky's face when he said it and his face of shock when that happened. Nothing from the White House. We were just checking in with sources on the timing of all of this, but no comment on the gaffe that he had. But I think, that's not exactly maybe the way they wanted to start out the evening. But they have been preparing for this. They're saying, with what they're doing at NATO this week, they feel, a strong performance. His opening remarks on Tuesday, having these meetings this week. They've been keeping him very busy in front of the cameras. So they are feeling, at least on the front of it, publicly, that they are standing behind him and feel like he will do it.
And Nancy Pelosi was also using this, right, to try and tamp down the rebellion and say, look, don't do it in the middle of the NATO conference.
Has Joe got any feel for why the delay?
No, we have not heard any delay. Now, the whole day, to be fair, has been backed up, right? It's all backed up.
Yeah.
But what's he doing right?
It does give rise to other questions.
Yeah.
Like if there's one time you want to be organized.
Well, and one time you want to be early, or because we're getting later and later in the day. Listen, I didn't share this with you guys because I don't like to share a lot of private emails, but I got an email from a friend of mine this morning, a Democrat, who said he got a letter from a donor saying that Biden is getting out of the race. Okay, and I recognize that's an email, that's not a good source, but here's why because I went back and I said, if he's getting out of the race, why would he do the presser tonight? And I'm sitting here wondering, are they going to do the presser? Or is this just not going to happen tonight?
They're going to do it.
You think
they're going to.
Okay.
Look, if they don't do the presser, that's the answer, right?
Right.
That is it. Look, either way, the press conference and the discussion around it, and I think we have to be sober about it because it's easy to kind of get into the politics of it. But you think about the idea on the world stage that we are now all sitting here waiting for the president's first press conference in 6 months, wondering if he can make it an hour, coherently answering questions. That's the bar, which is sort of stunning that we're in that place. But Blake, what do you make of the fact that this White House, rather than sort of lean into the gravity of the situation and acknowledge the American people's broad, as we've seen in polling, concerns based on the debate, and almost make fun of it? They've called it his big boy press conference. They've sort of flirted with this idea that, the press is just being silly about this.
So let's be clear. Something like this at 7:30 at night here in Washington after NATO probably doesn't happen if the debate doesn't happen, right?
Never.
And that's part of the issue for the White House now and for the campaign is they're trying to play catch up, right? And they're trying to play catch up in the format that doesn't work for them because of the president. And look, if he wanted to do this often, like Donald Trump or Barack Obama, he'd do it often. He's the president. NATO, we're doing this, next week, let's do that. But the only reason I suspect that this is happening tonight, and you can make the argument, yes, NATO, maybe he would do something like this, and in the past he's done something like this. But for them, to your point, to sort of build it up in the format that they are trying to hype this up as a way of saying, look, he can do this. And the fact that we are even having this conversation is astonishing. The fact that we are even in the place, Leland, where you have now, 13, 14, 15 Democrats who have come out against the sitting president is astonishing. If this goes awful tonight for the president, you are going to see an avalanche of more Democrats come out. That in and of itself is astonishing. Here we are.
Yeah, and the wavering Biden supporters, this new line, right, the president has a decision to make. The president will tell you he's already made his decision. Right. Sent a letter to Congress saying, I've made my decision. And yet, Richard Blumenthal, big Democrat from Connecticut, Tim Kaine, the former vice presidential nominee, Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, all the way through Michael Bennet of Colorado, Cori Bush, who had supported him, Joe Manchin, that we just heard from. Lauren, how long can this go on for before it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Not much longer, and it's really devastating to watch. I don't take any joy in the cringeworthy nature of these gaffes and mistakes. And, you say the seal is an asset. In a typical year for an incumbent president, it's a dream to campaign from behind the presidential podium. I think there's no bigger detriment to him because every time he appears before that seal, it's just more clear that he can't do the job. He's not up to the task. And the question is, shouldn't he step down right now instead of can he run?
But quite literally, though, it can go on as long as he wants, right? And the only way for this to stop is the 25th Amendment, which, if it were to ever get to that point, I think you would see it end. Or if, as it relates to him running again for another 4 years at the convention, and he's already basically said, I dare you, I challenge you at the convention. So there are, you're right, but there are, he literally could run this out as long as he wants.
I don't know if the control room still has Tom Dempsey up. It'd be interesting to know whether the reporters have been let in. So we're going to work on that. Speaking of these reporters, there's two groups here, I think, that have something to prove tonight, right? Mm-hmm. President Biden obviously has something to prove. And Kelly, the White House press corps has something to prove. Because for 3 years, they sort of bought into the idea that, he has gaffes and yes, he has missteps. But really behind the scenes, he's this sharp, eagle-eyed leader who's making decisions and available at all hours of the night. That was laid bare to be false. And I'm wondering, you've been in the room for the past 2 weeks with the reporters over on Pebble Beach, which is the North Lawn where everybody does their live shots. The White House press room is not much bigger than this studio. If we take the wide shot, it's not that big. Yeah. You've been there too. And Kelly, I'm wondering, what's the atmosphere the past couple of weeks been like?
It's been combative. It's changed. And it's also something I've noticed because I was in the Pentagon briefing room. And in the Pentagon briefing room, we would always follow up on one another. And I always said I wish that the White House press corps did that because we would get so many more answers if we followed up.
By follow up, you mean like
I
want an answer to his question.
And and they want to move on. And then the next person asks it. And we saw this more and more with the White House press corps trying to say, are you being transparent with us? Because we saw evidence of that with what Karine was coming out and saying at the podium during the afternoon, and then what the president was saying later that night. We saw them issue a clarification on the doctor just on Monday night after a briefing. So I think you're seeing the press corps starting to follow up on one another, which they may do today, especially if one person asks the question on the list and then they go down to the next question. And it may be more combative. It may be more a harder White House press corps than we've seen.
Right, so it looks like the press is now filing in. Is this the press or is this White House staff? Is that Lloyd? I think it's Lloyd Austin who's there. White House staff, Karine Jean-Pierre is there in the front row. And then we'll see how this goes. Mick, I can't believe we've gotten 15 minutes into a news show. And we have not mentioned the word Donald Trump, because for the past 8 years, that never happened. And I'm wondering what you make, having worked for him, of a man for the first time in his political career has figured out discipline and letting the other side continuing to dig.
I think you're seeing him evolve as a candidate. He wasn't able to do this in 2020. There's lots of folks who told him in 2020, if you just get out of the way, Joe Biden is a gaffe machine and he will dig a hole for himself. And when he went into the first debate in 2020 against Joe Biden, all he did was interrupt him all night, and it probably cost him the election. I go back to the debate, it's almost 2 weeks ago now. There was an instant where they had a split screen, and what Trump did, I could see his face. He turned his head and sort of looked at Biden, and it's an unusual look. I've seen the look before, and you could tell he sort of stepped back, like he knew that Biden was off that night, and he dialed it down from there, and he's been dialed down for him ever since. Look, he's up in the polls because of it. The left is beside themselves because they can't talk about Donald Trump right now. They're fascinated by this, and they have to be. This is the biggest issue in the room. So, look, Donald Trump is a big winner in the last 10 days. There's no question about it. I do think that Trump privately is sort of like I am, hoping that Joe Biden does well tonight.
There's no question that Team Trump wants to run against Joe Biden, and that is the issue we'll tackle when we come back. Welcome back. Live pictures now of inside the room where President Biden will take the stage. You can see the media is there, as is much of President Biden's national security staff. Now coming up on an hour and 50 minutes late. There has been an enormous amount of focus, as well there should be, on President Biden and the stakes for him. They are incredibly high as the world is watching him, as he has promised that this is going to be proof in the beginning, if you might say, of his comeback. There's also a lot of focus on the press corps, specifically the White House press corps in this room, who for a number of years probably covered up, or at least went along with the White House's view of President Biden's physical condition and mental condition. And in the past 2 weeks, the White House has gotten a gut punch from the press. Media analyst, NewsNation contributor Steve Krakauer with us, as is the panel. Steve, in a sense, I'm a reporter. I've been part of the White House press corps. When they smell blood, which they did and loved going after Donald Trump now for 8 years, it is like a pack of wolves. And I'm wondering if now that same pack of wolves is going to turn. They have turned. They're on the Joe Biden story. If they're not going to go almost overboard and be unfair tonight in a way to prove to the American people that they were in the bag for Team Blue.
Yeah, well, this is, first of all, Leland, thank you for having me. I have to say, it's great to be with you as we kill time and await what could be one of the most consequential moments in American history. So happy to be joining you as we do this. Yes, look, I think, though, when you talk about are they going to go overboard, this is going to be a series of the absolute hardest questions that President Biden and potentially Joe Biden, if you look at his entirety of his career, has ever faced. I mean, that is literally what the stakes are. But I also think about the debate. 2 weeks ago tonight was that debate, and CNN's moderators, who did just a great job in not going overboard and just asking normal questions of the president, and he was unable to handle those sorts of questions. They don't need to go overboard. They need to ask him direct questions, and they need to see whether he can handle it. And certainly everything we've seen, whether at the debate and in the interview since, shows that he cannot.
Look, and even today, and Mick Mulvaney pointed it out very well, when he was on the teleprompter, he was reading just fine about President Zelensky in Ukraine. And the second that it was not scripted, he confused President Zelensky and President Putin. Look, we don't know how long this is going to play out for. You've got the Republican National Convention next week, which God knows the Republicans would love nothing more than to move. Donald Trump's already delayed his VP pick now, could delay it even into the beginning of the convention to try and let the Joe Biden story just continue out there. But at some point, does the focus on every gaffe and every misstep and every slip of the tongue which if you're on television enough happens, again, does it go overboard to do that?
I think we're at the point. I mean, we are at the point. It feels like something has completely shifted. Where I agree with you. Literally every single what was a little gaffe in 2 years ago, if he had called President Zelensky, President Putin, and then sort of corrected himself, as we were pointed out by reporters in the room, because people yelled at him to say, "Oh, you called him the wrong name." He didn't just remember that by himself, but we would have all moved on. We are past that. There is no point of return at this point. And so yes, I think we are now past that, whether it's through the press or whether through the Democratic establishment. I mean, it is shocking to see these sorts of left-leaning figures that we recognize in the media, the Pod Save America guys, Ezra Klein from the New York Times, who are relentlessly going after Joe Biden in a way that the most objective journalists were not doing for the entirety of his presidency. And what has changed? Perception, essentially perception and not reality. And that is after what we saw 2 weeks ago on Thursday.
Yeah. Steve, stay with us throughout this, because your analysis on this is going to be most important. As you said, could be one of the more consequential moments of the modern American presidency here. Mick, take us, because you've been with presidents at times like this. What's happening in the hold room right now?
It's a great question. I know what would be happening with Donald Trump, which is we'd be having to hold him back before he rushes out to do it, because he loved doing these kinds of things. But I'm sitting here looking at this, wondering what could possibly be going on. And I apologize, my phone went off because I just got a notice to point out there's teleprompters on the stage. And, you know, Blake could be right. We're talking off camera that maybe that's for an opening statement, but there are teleprompters out for a press conference.
So you got teleprompters there, Leland, and you could see the podium, and then there's a couple teleprompters, and that would raise the question, why are there teleprompters at a press conference? You've got Lloyd Austin, Anthony Blinken, cabinet members there. What that means, I think, is what you're likely to get here is some sort of a statement off the top, post-NATO 3 days of events for the president, and then take questions.
They want to make this about NATO.
So what if it's now 7:26 East Coast time? What if they start at 7:30 and finish at 8? He gives a 5 or 7 minute opening statement, takes 3 or 4 questions, and leaves.
So that's the question, right?
Not
is
good
it
enough.
Is it enough? You just
Not
said
good enough.
Not good enough.
No.
Now, this is the question. What in the realm of possibilities of what we have seen Joe Biden capable of, and we'll be generous in charitable in our analysis of that. What would be good enough, Lauren?
Well, something he can't do, which is maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours of hard questions, like the debate or another debate right now against Donald Trump with the same rules. I don't think he's capable of those things. We're not going to get them. But the easy fix after the debate would have been do something similar right away to fix it. He's not capable of that.
And even if he does, if he stumbles again 2 days later, all the goodwill is
all
gone.
goes back.
So
they are announcing President Biden. You can see everyone stand up. What you are about to watch is one of the more consequential moments of President Biden.
Please. Well, good evening. We just concluded this year's NATO summit. The consensus among the members was it was a great success. It's especially momentous because it represented the 75th year of the most important military defense alliance in the world's history of the world. We should never forget that NATO grew out of the wreckage of World War II, the most destructive war in history. The idea was to create an alliance of free and democratic nations that would commit themselves to a compact of collective defense. Standing together, they knew we'd all be safer. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. And it's worked because a would-be aggressor knows if they attack one of us, they'll be attacked by all of us. Sending that message is the best way to deter aggression and prevent wars in the first place. For those who thought NATO's time had passed, they got a rude awakening when Putin invaded Ukraine. Some of the oldest and deepest fears in Europe roared back to life because once again, a murderous madman was on the march. But this time, no one cowered in appeasement, especially the United States. We collected intelligence that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine months before the invasion. I directed the intelligence community to be a significant amount of intelligence be declassified so I could start building an international coalition to oppose the invasion. Then in February, some of you remember, I warned the world that the invasion was imminent. I rallied a coalition of 50 nations from Europe to Asia to help Ukraine defend itself. Many foreign policy experts thought, as Putin amassed Russian forces just 100 miles north of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, but Putin thought it was the mother home of Russia. The capital would fall in less than a week. But the Ukrainian people, backed by a coalition to help build, stopped them. Today, Kyiv still stands, and NATO stands stronger than it has ever been. During the week of this summit, several heads of states made it a point in their statements to thank the United States and to thank me personally for all that NATO has achieved. NATO is not only stronger, NATO is bigger because we led the charge to bring in Finland and Sweden into the alliance, and it makes a gigantic difference. Excuse me. Meanwhile, my predecessor has made it clear he has no commitment to NATO. He's made it clear that he would feel no obligation to honor Article 5. He's already told Putin, and I quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." In fact, the day after Putin invaded Ukraine, here's what he said. It was genius. It was wonderful. Some of you forgot that, but that's exactly what he said. But I made it clear a strong NATO is essential to American security. And I believe the obligation of Article 5 is sacred. And I would remind all Americans, Article 5 is invoked only once in NATO's long history, and that was to defend America after 9/11. I made it clear that I will not bow down to Putin. I will not walk away from Ukraine. I will keep NATO strong. That's exactly what we did, and exactly what we'll continue to do. Now, the future of American policy is up to the American people. This is much more than a political question. It's more than that. It's a national security issue. Don't reduce this to the usual testament that people talk about, issues of being a political campaign. It's far too important. It's about the world we live in for decades to come. Every American must ask herself or himself, is the world safer with NATO? Are you safer? Is your family safer? I believe the American people know. The answer to all those questions is yes. And I believe the American people understand that America is stronger because of our alliances. I believe the American consensus from Truman to Reagan to me still holds today. America cannot retreat from the world. We must lead the world. We are an indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright wrote. Now let me turn to three other key issues. Just this morning, we had a great economic report showing inflation is down. Overall prices fell last month. Core inflation is the lowest it's been in 3 years. Prices are falling for cars, appliances, and airfares. Grocery prices have fallen since the start of the year. We're going to keep working to take down corporate greed to bring those prices down further. Meanwhile, Trump's calling for a 10% tariff on everything Americans buy, including food from overseas, vegetables, and other necessities. And economists tell us that would cost the average American working family another $2,500 a year. It's a tax of $2,500 a year. Second, our efforts to secure the border, the southern border, is working. After Trump killed the bipartisan effort to secure the border, Republicans and Democrats had worked on, because he thought it would benefit me and make him a loser, Republicans walked away. So I took executive action last month. As a consequence, working with Mexico, border encounters have gone down over 50%. The current level is lower today than when Trump left office. Third, for months, the United States has been working to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring the hostages home, to create a path for peace and stability in the Middle East. 6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close. We're making progress. The trend is positive, and I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now. Let me conclude where I began. We're the United States of America. We are the indispensable nation. Our leadership matters. Our partnerships matter. This moment matters. We must rise to meet it. With that, I'll take your questions. I've been given a list of people to call on here. Reuters, Jeff Mason.
Mr. President, your political future has hung over the NATO summit a little bit this week. Speaker Pelosi made a point of suggesting that your decision on whether to stay in the race was still open. George Clooney and a handful of lawmakers have called on you to step aside. Reuters is reporting tonight that UAW leadership is concerned about your ability to win.
UAW just endorsed me, but go ahead.
Thank you. My question for you is, how are you incorporating these developments into your decision to stay? And separately, what concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one, the fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now, later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go in this campaign. And so I'm just going to keep moving. And because, look, I got more work to do. We've got more work to finish. There's so much, we made so much progress. Think about it. Think about where we are economically relative to the rest of the world. Name me a world leader who wouldn't want to trade places with our economy. We've created over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, 1.5 million jobs. So things are moving. We got more to go. Working class people still need help. Corporate greed is still at large. Their prices, the corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic. They're coming down. And so I'm optimistic about where things are going. Danny Kemp, AFP.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask you about you mixed up Presidents Zelensky and Putin earlier today. And you now have sort of your key allies, including the British Prime Minister, the President of France, the German Chancellor having to step in and make excuses for you on that. Officials here are saying off the record that your decline has become noticeable. Hasn't this now, frankly, become damaging for America's standing in the world? Thank you.
Did you see any damage to our standing in my leading this conference? Have you seen a more successful conference? What do you think? And the Putin piece, I was talking about Putin, and I said, and now, at the very end, I said, Putin. I said, no, I'm sorry, Zelensky. And then I added 5 other names. Look, guys, the idea anybody suggests that we haven't had an incredibly successful conference. How many times did you hear in that conference, I know it sounds too self-serving, but other leaders, heads of state, in thanking me, saying the reason we're together is because of Biden, because Biden did the following. Look, folks, this is well, anyway, I thought it was the most successful conference I've attended in a long time, and find me a world leader who didn't think it was. Next one. Nancy Cordes, CBS.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned other instances in history where presidents have faced a challenge, but what makes this moment in history so unique is that it is not your enemies who are calling on you to reconsider your decision to stay in the race. It's your friends, supporters, people who think you've done a great job over the past 4 years. Have you spent time thinking about what it would mean for your legacy, which you've worked decades to build, if you stay in the race, despite the concerns that voters say they have, and you lose to someone who you yourself have argued is unfit to return to the Oval Office?
Well, look, I'm not in this for my legacy. I'm in this to complete the job I started. As you recall, understandably, many of you and many economists thought my initial initiatives that I put forward, can't do that, it's going to cause inflation, things are going to skyrocket, the debt's going to go up. What are you hearing now from mainstream economists? 16 economic Nobel laureates said I've done a hell of a job. That under my plan so far and what's going to happen in the future if I'm reelected, that things are going to get much better. Our economy is growing. I was determined when I got elected to stop the trickle-down economic theory, that if the wealthy did very well, everybody else would do well. My dad was a well-read, decent guy. I don't remember much trickling down on his kitchen table. Middle-class people and working-class people need help. And so what happened is I decided to was able to implement as president what I believed when I was a senator. And that is that the way to build this economy is from the middle out and the bottom up. That way we grow the economy. And the wealthy still do very well. They do fine. And guess what? Find me an mainstream economist who said we haven't done well. What have we not done that isn't working right now? And so we got more to do, though. We got to finish the job. And by the way, I come from the corporate state of the world. Delaware has more corporations registered in Delaware than every other state in the nation combined. I'm not anti-corporate, but corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic. Doubled. It's time things get back in order a little bit. It's time, for example, if I'm reelected, we're going to make sure that rents are kept at 5% increase, corporate rents for apartments and the like and homes are limited to 5%. We're going to make a lot of changes that I've been talking about because we're going to continue to grow this economy. And by the way, remember how I got so roundly criticized for being so pro-union, not labor, union. Well, guess what? I've been the most pro-union labor president in history. Not a joke. And guess what? We had the Treasury Department do a study. When unions do better, everybody does better. Everybody does better. And we talk about how, for example, remember when we talked about getting the computer chip industry back in the United States? Used to be 40% of the industry. We invented the chip. 40% of the industry was in the United States. And former presidents decided that the best way to do it is find the cheapest labor in the world, send the product over there and import what the product was. And so what did I do? I was told not to go over to Asia, including Europe, but Asia. And I remember going to South Korea, convincing them to invest $20 billion in the United States to build computer chip factories. And I asked why when they finally decided to do it. And the answer was because you have the safest economy in the world and you have the best workers in the world. So the whole idea here is we've invested, there's over $50 billion in investment in computer chip manufacturing just coming into being. None of you thought that would happen. None of you thought that would happen. But it's happening. It's happening. And it's going to grow economies. All through, and by the way, red states and blue states. Matter of fact, there's as much in red states as in blue states. I've made no distinction. So my generic point is that the idea that we can't continue to build and grow the economy, make it fairer. And like I said, from my standpoint, when the middle class does well, that's when the whole economy grows. The poor have a shot, the wealthy do well. But the wealthy got to start paying their taxes.
As a follow-up, sir, you mentioned that your Vice President Kamala Harris would be ready to serve on day one. Can you elaborate on that? What is it about her attributes and her accomplishments over the last 4 years that make her ready to serve on day one if necessary?
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her. Felicia Schwartz, Financial Times.
Thank you, Mr. President. Presidency is the most straining job in the world, and it's 24/7. How can you say you'll be up for that next year, in 2 years, in 4 years, given the limits you've acknowledged that you have today?
The limits I've acknowledged I have?
There's been reporting that you've acknowledged that you need to go to bed earlier and your evening around 8.
That's not true. Look, what I said was, instead of my every day starting at 7 and going to bed at midnight, it'd be smarter for me to pace myself a little more. And I said, for example, the 8, 7, 6 stuff, instead of starting a fundraiser at 9 o'clock, start at 8 o'clock. People get to go home by 10 o'clock. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, and if you look at my schedule since I made that stupid mistake in the campaign, in the debate, I mean, my schedule has been full bore. I've done, where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball? I mean, look, he's done virtually nothing. And I have, I don't know how many, don't hold me to, roughly 20 major events. Some of them with thousands of people showing up. And so I just think it's better. I always have an inclination, whether I was playing sports or doing politics, just to keep going, not stop. I just got to just pace myself a little more. Pace myself. And the next debate, I'm not going to be traveling into 15 time zones a week before. Anyway, that's what it was about. That's what it was about. And by the way, even with that, I love my staff, but they add things all the time. At the very end, I'm catching hell from my wife for that. Anyway, I'm sorry. Zeke Miller, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 questions for you. First, on the NATO summit, President Zelensky, in your meeting with him, he pressed you to lift your limitations on the Ukrainian use of American weapons, saying that, in his public remarks afterwards, saying that Ukraine cannot win the war unless those limitations are lifted. Are you reconsidering your position on that? And then secondly, following up on Felicia's question there, leaders of your own party have said that they're not worried about that debate. They're worried about the next bad night and the bad night after that. How can you reassure the American people that you are up to the task and that there won't be more bad nights at a debate stage or somewhere else?
First thing about Zelensky asking for the ability to strike deep into Russia. We've allowed Zelensky to use American weapons in the near term, in the near or abroad, into Russia. Whether or not he should be attacked. For example, should Zelensky, he's not. If he had the capacity to strike Moscow, strike the Kremlin, would that make sense? It wouldn't. The question is, what's the best use of the weaponry he has, and the weaponry we're getting to him? I've gotten them more long-range capacity as well as defensive capacity. And so our military is where I'm following the advice of my commander-in-chief, the chief of staff of the military, as well as the Secretary of Defense and our intelligence people. And we're making a day-to-day basis on what they should and shouldn't go, how far they should go in. That's a logical thing to do. Second question related to
bad nights, sir. How can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or on some matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself. And that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's got more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs just last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet. None. Who I got here? Merrick, Pulaski Radio.
Thank you, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm well.
The elections in the US have consequences around the world. You have pretty high standing in Europe. I just asked President Macron about you, and he said we are happy to have him as the President of the United States. But there is a concern. Many people in Poland and across Europe are worried that the former president may win the election. And there's a lot of concern that Donald Trump may weaken NATO, stop supporting Ukraine, or push Ukraine to give up territories to Russia.
They're correct.
And yourself was warning just 2 minutes ago about it. So my question is, do you think that Europe will be left on its own if Donald Trump wins the election? And what's your advice to European leaders to prepare for possible US disengagement?
Well, look, I think, how can I say this without sounding too self-serving? I'm not having any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward. It'd be a disaster. It'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point. And he seems to have an affinity to people who are authoritarian. That worries, as I tell you, Poland, that worries Europe. That worries Poland. And nobody, including the people of Poland, think that if he wins in Ukraine, he's going to stop in Ukraine, that that's going to be the end of it. And so what I can say is, I think I'm the best qualified person to do the job, to make sure that Ukraine does not fall, that Ukraine succeeds, that the European alliance stays strong. You may recall, no one was talking about Finland joining NATO. I remember talking to Putin right after we got elected in Geneva, and he was talking about what we should do. We couldn't be in Eastern Europe, et cetera. And I said, you're looking for the Finlandization of Ukraine. I said, you're going to get the NATOization of Finland. And about 4 weeks later, I got a call. No, that's not true. Probably 5 months later, from the president of Finland, could he come and see me? In my office, I invited him to the Oval Office. We sat down and talked. He said he wanted to join NATO. Could I help? And I did. It wasn't automatic. And then I got a call from the Swedes. I beg your pardon? And so Finland joined NATO, 800-mile border is significant, and they're already allies, but they weren't part of NATO. And you heard, I think you heard, maybe I can't recall what he said in our closed meeting, but he wouldn't mind it being repeated. He said, we decided in Finland, the people of Finland decided they had to be part of NATO. It was in our interest because of the joint ability to be together, to dissuade any attack on Finland. And the same thing with Sweden. It took a lot of selling to some folks, particularly in Turkey and other places, to agree to the expansion. But it expanded. And we're a hell of a lot stronger because of it. We're more secure because of it. And by the way, I was able to get 50 other nations, 50, to support Ukraine. 50. We were able to bring about a coalition of Europe and Asia, Japan and South Korea. I just we talked about AUKUS, and we talked about the relationship between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, the United States. We're making the world safer and stronger because we have to deal with the new arrangement that exists in the world. The Cold War is over. The post-war era is over. What is going to replace it? And I respectfully suggest I have a pretty good idea what that should be. I've convinced a lot of people to follow it, and we're just going to get stronger. David Sanger. Where is it?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Be nice, David.
Mr. President, the NATO declaration that was issued yesterday was very notable because it described China as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine for its provision of critical goods to the Russians. That's part of a broader partnership that seems to have cemented in place in the past 2 or 3 years. I think one that you were a little bit doubtful of when we asked you about it some time ago. So I'd be interested to know whether you have a strategy now of trying to interrupt the partnership between China and Russia, and whether or not in a second term you would pursue that, if you could describe that strategy to us. And along the way, could you also tell us whether you think, just to follow up on Felicia's question, that if you were in a room with Vladimir Putin again, the way you were 3 years ago, or with President Xi, that a few years from now you will be able to go negotiate with them, handle them one-on-one?
Well, the first part of the question is, we discussed and I raised in the NATO summit, and others raised, the future of China's involvement, what they're going to do, what they're doing with Russia in terms of accommodating, facilitating them. They're getting access to additional. They're not supplying weapons themselves. They're supplying mechanisms for them to be able to get weapons. And China's position is basically, and I've spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader has, over 90 hours since being vice president all the way through, for real. And by the way, I handed all my notes. But my point is that Xi believes that China is a large enough market that they can entice any country, including European countries, to invest there in return for commitments from Europe to do A, B, C, or D, or not to do certain things. What's happened is we had a long discussion about what we have to make clear. China has to understand that if they are supplying Russia with information and capacity, along with working with North Korea and others to help Russia in armament, that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of that by getting the kind of investment they're looking for. And so, for example, we're in a situation where, and we've reestablished direct contact with China after that, remember the balloon, quote unquote, going down, and all of a sudden things came to an end? Well, we set up a new mechanism. There's a direct line between she and me, and our military has direct access to one another, and they contact one another when we have problems. The issue is that we have to make sure that she understands there's a price to pay for undercutting both the Pacific Basin as well as Europe, and as it relates to Russia and dealing with Ukraine. And so for example, if you want to invest in China, as you know this area really well. If you want to invest in China, you have to have a 51% Chinese owner. You have to make sure that you do by their rules, and you don't have the authority, and you have to provide all access to all the data and information you have. There was a while there, as you recall, the last administration and other administrations, where the access to that market was enticing enough to get companies to come in because they had access to over 1 billion people in a market, not 1 billion, but a lot of people in the market. And so they were doing it. But that got curtailed when we started saying we're going to play by the same rules. For example, the idea they don't abide by the international rules related to subsidizing products by the government funding. So guess what? They're not going to be able to export their electric vehicles to the United States without a significant tariff. Others are doing the same thing around the world. But it is a concern. It is a concern that you have both China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, countries that are not necessarily coordinated in the past, looking to figure out how they can have impact.